My name is Owen Symes, and welcome to The Copagandist, a podcast about cop shows and the people who make them. Today begins the first episode in our series on Jack Webb, first and most important of the TV Copagandists. He pioneered a new kind of cop show, one that combined aspects of pre-existing radio and film technique with conservative ideology and savvy public relations, the result being a genre-defining show. Dragnet. When it began airing in 1951, Dragnet solidified a genre staple of network TV, one that would influence everything from The Mod Squad to Miami Vice, The Shield to The Rookie. All cop shows owe a debt to Dragnet and to Webb. Now, Dragnet came out of an artistic and economic context far removed from our own, so we'll need to situate his work within the broader milieu of radio and film as it existed in the 1930s and 1940s. That is the task of this week's episode. Next week, we'll cover the birth and early development of television in the US. With all that groundwork laid, we'll then turn to covering Jack Webb proper. So let's start with early radio and film. It's easy to forget now, but wireless communication really did revolutionize human life. Prior to this, messages were limited by bulk and by distance. That changed in the 19th century, first with the telegraph, then the telephone, and finally the radio, wireless telephony. Together, these technologies liberated mass communication from the confines of physical distance. Wireless quickly took off with industrial and military types first, but it took a little time for government regulators to act in any systematic way. Republicans dominated the federal government at the turn of the 20th century, and they preferred small government, which means bigness is business friendly, not that it's actually small. But Herbert Hoover, then Treasury Secretary for President Harding, was an engineer as well as a classical liberal, so he couldn't help but understand the need for standardization if radio were to be used on a national level. In 1922, Hoover tried to get these coyote-eyed companies of the radio industry to agree on standardization for things like unified processes for channel assignment, standards on transmission power, and regulations for bandwidth use. The industry pitched a fit until 1927, by which point they realized and admitted that some regulation was needed so that these companies could all play by the same rules. This resulted in the Radio Act and the creation of the Federal Radio Commission, the FRC. Among other things, this commission was tasked with granting and theoretically revoking broadcast licenses, stipulating that license holders had to act in the public interest, whatever that meant. The law also outlawed over-the-air obscenity. Now, in terms of specific censorship power, Section 29 of the law gave the Commission two mutually contradictory instructions. Quote, "Nothing in this act shall be understood or construed to give the licensing authority the power of censorship over radio communications or signals transmitted by any radio station, and no regulation or condition shall be promulgated or fixed by the licensing authority which shall interfere with the right of free speech by means of radio communications. Period. Full stop. No person within the jurisdiction of the United States shall utter any obscene, indecent, or profane language by means of radio communication." What? This vague definition of public interest and the contradictory language regarding censorship would leave much room for further disagreement. Great for lawyers, but confusing for everyone else. Now, one of the effects of the Radio Act was the consolidation of the radio industry, which had been much more diffuse up until this point. Larger companies could better afford to handle the red tape, and were also better able to carry favor with the members of the commission when granting licenses and things like that. The leaders of this move towards mergers and acquisitions framed their takeover of smaller competitors in the language of engineering, of efficiency, stability, consistency. One notable giant to emerge at this time was RCA, which manufactured radio sets. In 1926, it created the National Broadcasting Company, or NBC, the country's first national radio broadcaster, so it beamed signals across the whole country rather than just a specific city or region. By the early 1930s, RCA controlled two national broadcast networks, NBC Red and NBC Blue. Regulation grew less business-friendly under FDR. This isn't a revolution by any means. FDR was not a socialist or a communist or anything, despite what Rush Limbaugh and those people will tell you. But he did try and institute a little bit more regulation, reining in some of the abuses of big business, God forbid. In 1934, he advocated for and signed into law a new Communication Act, which replaced the FRC with the Federal Communications Commission, FCC, updating its mandate to include both radio and television broadcasts. Television wasn't common at this time, but it was new technology, and the law was trying to get a jump on regulating this new thing. Kind of unusual for federal regulation, actually. It's pretty cool. Under FDR's appointees, the FCC would shift towards a more, you can call it antagonistic or just a little bit more active relationship with larger radio broadcasters, culminating in the 1940s with two major regulatory battles. First, in a victory for the federal government, the FCC charged RCA with monopolistic practices by controlling both the making of radios and, through two national broadcast networks, what was played on these radios. The industry responded to this attack with promises for better self-regulation, but this did not appease the FCC or the government's lawyers. The case went to trial, and after years of legal back and forth, RCA finally agreed to divest itself of its broadcast networks. NBC Red became simply NBC, and NBC Blue became the American Broadcasting Company, or ABC. In 1946, after FDR's death, came the second flashpoint, when the FCC published a report, Public Service Responsibility of Broadcast Licensees, aka the Blue Book, which detailed the current process of license renewal and argued that the FCC, surprise, needed to stop being a regulatory rubber stamp for business and actually take seriously the legally mandated requirement that broadcasters act in the public interest. Maybe revoke some broadcast licenses for institutions that didn't meet this standard. The Blue Book tried to flesh out the vague law mentioning public interest with 4 things that stations could do to foster this. Supplement commercial programming with sustaining programs that were free of corporate sponsorship. They could encourage locally produced shows rather than just rebroadcasting what the biggest players in the industry made. They could broadcast shows concerned with current events and public issues, and they could rein in the excesses of their many advertisers. Now, back in 1923, radio broadcasters had done what businesses always do and pooled their lobbying resources into a trade association, the National Association of Broadcasters, or NAB. In an effort to appease some of their critics, the NAB promulgated a code of ethics for radio broadcasts in 1928 and updated it several times in the ensuing decade, attempting to placate regulators and others that thought that radio was kind of junk. Now, like the U.S. Constitution, this document lacked any specific enforcement mechanisms, so it was really easy to just ignore the rules. When the FCC published its Blue Book recommendations, the NAB criticized this as tyrannical, its president declaring it to be a reversion to that type of government control and regulation from which our forefathers struggled to escape. I'm just assuming he talked like that because it's the 1920s and 30s. As an alternative to stronger federal regulation, the NAB again updated its code of ethics, this time including a stronger list of prohibited language and stipulations for the do's and don'ts of different radio programming genres. But it still had no enforcement mechanism, so stations didn't give a fuck. This is a recurring theme in the history of broadcasting. We're going to come back to this again and again. Ultimately, business lobbying coupled with a resurgence of Republican power in Congress during Truman's somewhat lame presidency snuffed out this effervescence of FCC vigor. Broadcasting remained into the 1950s a loosely regulated business, and its major players coalesced into three giants. NBC and ABC we've already met, but a third major player, the Columbia Broadcasting System, or CBS, emerged in the 1940s. Together, these companies formed a broadcasting triumvirate, well placed to take advantage of television. Now, radio would form a major commercial context from which the TV business would emerge. And radio also heavily influenced much of early TV art, but film also played an important role. Moving pictures had burst onto the scene practically at the same time as radio and became big business in no time. People wanted to see them, studios sprang up to meet the demand. Unlike radio, which fell under federal First Amendment protections, from pretty early on, film was seen as something lesser. In 1915, the Supreme Court held that movies were, quote, a business, pure and simple, a spectacle or show, and not such vehicles of thought as to bring them within the press of the country. They weren't protected by the free press stipulations of the Constitution. While the federal government itself lacked specific powers to censor films, this court ruling did allow governments at the lower levels, so state and municipal, to censor as they saw fit, inaugurating a running battle between various censorship boards and the distributors of moving pictures. And these censors increasingly found themselves occupied with one particular adversary. The movie gangster, Shay. So the gangster and his discontents. Crime has made up a good portion of U.S. fiction kind of forever at this point, emerging from the local court reporting of the 18th century and the detective fiction of the 19th century that we imported from France and England. U.S. authors gave crime fiction their own domestic spin with the hard-boiled detective novel of the 1920s. And the conventions of these printed works easily found their way into early radio and film. Just like any other new medium, video games are an example today, people love to cut costs by just adapting existing things into a new form. Now, the particular economic and political pressures of the Great Depression would push this crime fiction in new directions. Early radio crime shows pulled from franchises like Sherlock Holmes, Philip Marlowe. Police in these stories were typically either peripheral, having like an ancillary or a secondary part in the proceedings. Maybe they put the handcuffs on the bad guy, but that didn't really solve the crime. Or they were downright antagonistic. Read Red Harvest from the late 1920s and tell me those cops are the good guys. Even some newer radio characters like the Falcon and the Green Hornet continued this disinterest in or distaste for the police. In the Green Hornet, we see a marked antagonism towards the police. The main character, Britt Reed, spent his days as the publisher of a newspaper, not exactly a police officer's best friend, although they're not the most antagonistic either, as it turns out in real life. That's a whole other story. He moonlighted as a crime fighter, and his escapades often brought the ire of police officials in these shows. He was constantly the target of arrest warrants and vehicular pursuits. It was crazy. Like their radio counterparts, filmmakers in the silent era, so up to the late 1920s, loved to depict fictional versions of court cases and famous crimes. The police were depicted often as buffoons, most famously in the Keystone Cops series, but also in the works of legends like Buster Keaton and Charlie Chaplin. Many in positions of power didn't appreciate this, as it turns out, and so various local authorities, cities like New York or Detroit, issued their own lists of censorship guidelines. These parameters often insisted upon morally upright endings to films featuring crime. They also sought to prevent knowledge of criminal practices from being shown to impressionable audiences, especially kids. The Depression hit the movie business hard. What a surprise. But Warner Bros. Did actually manage some success with its gangster films in the 1930s, starting with Little Caesar and Public Enemy in 1931, two of the year's top earners. The police and their political allies saw these movies as frustratingly subversive because the cops were neither the heroes, the protagonists, or even the ones ultimately responsible for the downfall of the gangsters. In Public Enemies, it is rival gangsters that slay the criminal protagonist, Tommy Powers. And in Little Caesar, our kind of anti-hero, Rico Bandello, is a gangster killed by a hail of cop gunfire. That's true. But it was his vaulting ambition that led him to that violent death, not the crime-fighting diligence of the police. Now, whatever the ideological bent of these film executives, producers, and creatives, they just wanted to make money. So people saw that gangster films were popular. They made more of them. Like 50 of them came out over the next few years. It wasn't really about ideology. It was just about profit. So the popularity and ubiquity of these movies fed into what was already kind of a pre-existing negative view of the police that was remarkably common at the time. Maybe it's hard to understand this today, at least for middle-class white viewers. But back in the early decades of the 20th century, the concept of the professional police was still relatively new. Departments had only begun forming before the Civil War, and after that period, their legal authority took decades to accrue and solidify. By the turn of the century, many still distrusted, disliked, or disregarded the cops. The working class thought of them as strikebreakers, the middle class criticized their corruption, the upper class continued to be frustrated at their professional incompetence. Cops didn't feel like they had a lot of friends at the time, and that seems like that's pretty true. This negative view of the cops continued into the 1930s as national papers carried stories of police corruption, especially regarding prohibition, and also incompetence, like their inability to solve a number of high-profile kidnappings or the rampant bank robberies that were going on at this time that people loved to talk about in the press. As historian Anthony Gregory summarized, police tended to be seen as poorly trained and implicated in corruption and criminality. Now, police leaders and politicians, business executives, didn't take these criticisms lying down. The most reform-minded among them tried to take the problems of corruption and incompetence head-on by continuing the professionalizing process with technology. Cars, radios, machine guns, forensic knowledge, new legislation. Putting aside the efficacy of these reforms, whether it really made the police good at their jobs, are these jobs we even want people to do, etc., the people engaging in these reforms thought that they were making real progress. And they wanted the public to know it. Progressives had by this time increasingly become aware of the power of mass media propaganda. They saw the cultural cachet and technological prowess of film and radio as a corrupting force, but not necessarily so. This could be turned towards positive social ends, if only directed to do so. Instead of propagating vice and criminality, maybe mass media could serve a hygienic propaganda purpose. Remember, at this point, the word propaganda didn't carry a necessarily negative connotation. Pioneering theorist Edward Bernays defined it in 1928, quote, "Modern propaganda is a consistent, enduring effort to create or shape events to influence the relations of the public to an enterprise, idea, or group." Bernays further observed that mass education, mass literacy, had kind of an unforeseen consequence, because it didn't produce a series of critical, individualized thinkers. Quote, "Instead of a mind, universal literacy has given the citizen rubber stamps. Rubber stamps inked with advertising slogans, with editorials, with published scientific data, with the trivialities of the tabloids and the platitudes of history, but quite innocent of original thought." So for Bernays and progressives who took his lead, propaganda was essential to the political process because it gave individual citizens the correct rubber stamp with which to impress the world. Bernays, again, quote, "In our present social organization, approval of the public is essential to any large undertaking. Hence a laudable movement may be lost unless it impresses itself on the public mind." And this was, of course, envisioned as a campaign of the knowing minority trying to enlighten the ignorant majority. One more Bernays quote, because his 1928 book, Propaganda, which he did a whole thing on Behind the Bastards a while ago, Really fascinating read, and actually not that long. Check it out. He said, quote, "Clearly, it is the intelligent minorities which need to make use of propaganda continuously and systematically. In the active proselytizing minorities, in whom selfish interests and public interests coincide, lie the progress and development of America. Only through the active energy of the intelligent few can the public at large become aware of and act upon new ideas." What a coincidence. The police, as a profession with growing group solidarity and an internal sense of identity built around a sense of martyrdom. Police always feel like they're under attack. They're the little babies of society and they need help. They considered themselves just such an intelligent minority, needful of their own mass media messaging. The public needed to understand the real struggle between cops and crime. Progressive reformers largely supported these efforts, for they understood the war on crime as it was developing under FDR as a fight not just against crime per se, but against lawlessness. A phenomenon that included corruption in politics and the police as well, but that could be rooted out, and then you could use the police to get rid of the actual criminals long term. Progressives wanted to get the word out. Whatever their imperfections, the members of the nation's professionalized police were working tirelessly to keep themselves, yes, and the streets clean. Now, police reformers had already begun adapting wireless telephony to their own purposes, using telephone call boxes in the late 19th century, radio communication in some police departments in the early 20th century. By the 1920s, police innovators also began to see potential not just for wireless communication among themselves, but radio in particular, and its ability for public relations work, for shaping their image among the listening body. Early efforts at police communication were pretty blunt, to be honest. Very direct public addresses and lectures, educational series, like there was one from 1923 with the New York City Commissioner of Police. There was one in Pittsburgh with a professor of criminology. In 1936, the Michigan State Police used their Flint, Michigan broadcasting station to air a series of 18 lectures on topics ranging from the science of criminal apprehension and the operation of the radio-equipped patrol car to the training of officers and the importance of essentially being a snitch. They call it citizen police cooperation, but let's not kid ourselves here. As departments aired their own nonfiction content, they also began, especially by the late 1920s, to work with radio broadcasters to produce entertainment that would show police in a more positive light, making them the heroes rather than the villains or the second fiddles. They really wanted to hammer home that people should call local law enforcement rather than turning to some private detective or something like that. Radio producers quickly took to these shows because they were cheap, and it turned out they were pretty popular. People like crime stuff. It's dramatic. I get it. With police providing the raw material for stories, less had to be spent on writing. Police involvement gave them an air of authenticity, which provided a hook to the audience and precluded the need for expensive radio stars. Official support and sanction also bestowed upon these broadcasters an air of legitimacy and civic-mindedness. And although these shows were not the most popular thing on radio, they more than made back their budgets, and they became solid mainstays of many stations. Of the many shows to broadcast across local, regional, and national airwaves, a couple stand out as exemplars. Let's start in 1929 with True Detective Mysteries. This show was based on the stories presented in Bernard McFadden's magazine of the same name. McFadden himself, who until the 1920s had been known in the U.S. primarily as a health influencer. If you want more information on him, check out the Behind the Bastards episode. They talk about the milk diet that he advocated for, among other very entertaining things. He's a really funny guy. But he had established, by the late 1920s, a wide-ranging publishing empire. And as he grew older, his emphasis on hygiene took on a less personal and a more social bent. And he thought of taking on the problem of crime with this magazine and the radio show that came out of it, as a way to promote good, reliable, professional policing. In the magazine's first issue, he wrote an op-ed in which he said, quote, "No fiction writer pounding out machine-made plots can equal the truth itself, the truth of bizarre crimes committed by cunning men who leave no clues behind them, of detectives, clever, brainy, and brave, who take the tangled knot of circumstances into their hands and slowly, patiently unravel all its twistings and windings, until finally the great secret is disclosed and the criminal brought to justice." It does sound pretty cool. This magazine was maybe the first example of quote-unquote true crime literature as we would recognize it today, inspired, doing a lot of heavy lifting there, inspired by real events, sensationalized or maybe even maudlin, with an emphasis on detection, and undergirded by an ideology that thought of crime less like a social ill to be cured and more like a social war to be waged, just changing out one metaphor for another. True detective stories presented the police as, on the whole, hardworking professionals just trying to protect society from the vicious elements of the human heart. But it did so with an emotionality and a melodrama that most radio docudramas would not emulate. The earliest of these less, call them sentimental, a little bit more factual shows was called Police Headquarters and began airing in 1932. And it pulled from both classic detective and hard-boiled fiction. These were organized into 15-minute episodes, each beginning with a citizen calling headquarters to report a crime, typically something juicy like a murder, a kidnapping, or a robbery. Why not wage theft or political graft, I wonder? Usually the call would then be forwarded to the applicable officer, who would either investigate it himself or dispatch a beat cop in his stead. 39 episodes were produced, with about half being typical whodunits. The other half, however, focused not on detection, on figuring out the crime, but on apprehension. They already knew who did it, and they were just trying to find him. This emphasis on the thrill of the chase, on the hunt, rather than the curiosity of the mystery, was an innovation in the genre of crime fiction. And this would be taken a step further in a couple of subsequent shows, starting in 1933 with Calling All Cars, which focused specifically on mobile, technological, car-based policing. Stories revolved around the vehicular apprehension of criminals, and the show touted itself as based on actual police cases. Its sponsor, the Rio Grande Cracked Gasoline Company, proudly highlighted the fact that they provided gasoline to the Los Angeles Police Department. Well, good for them. Meanwhile, G-Men broadcast the exploits of the federal police. They may be a household name now, for better or worse, mileage may vary, but the FBI of the 1930s had really only just emerged as a national law enforcement body with actual resources and some cultural cachet at its disposal. This was partly due to the war on crime then being waged by FDR's New Deal, and partly as the result of its conniving director, J. Edgar Hoover, a guy who had never been on a stakeout in his life, but who excelled, really good at bureaucratic infighting. Couldn't throw a punch, but he could throw a memo. And he had real public relations acumen. In the early 1930s, he spent a lot of time beaming his and his agents' exploits onto the airwaves, highlighting their taking down of public enemies like John Dillinger, making sure everyone knew that they were taking care of business. It took Hoover a little bit longer to get into the fiction business. In 1935, radio producer Phillips, with an S, Lord, approached the Justice Department with an idea of working together to create a show about federal cops. Hoover was skeptical, but acquiesced at the request of Attorney General Homer Cummings, technically his boss. The result was G-Men, the first nationally broadcast show to focus entirely on the hunt, on apprehension. No longer about figuring out who did it at all. It's just about how are we going to get this person. Now, to preclude any possibility that the show's drama might interfere with an ongoing investigation, and also conveniently serving Hoover's public relations objectives, the show would present only solved FBI cases that had already been and gone. To help him with this, Lord brought on board noted crime reporter Courtney Riley Cooper, who had filled people's heads with fears of crime waves and told them about the power of the FBI to buttress the body politic. His most famous book was called 10,000 Public Enemies, in which he poured forth just a tidal wave of criminality and advocating for the FBI as the only dam capable of stopping the flood. Unfortunately for the project, the relationship between Hoover and Lord quickly soured. The producer and the bureaucrat just could not get along. Hoover thought that Lord's scripts were too sensational. Lord thought that the bureau chief was too suffocating, and only 13 episodes of the show aired before the whole project collapsed. Hoover would instead turn to Hollywood and detective magazines for his fictional stuff, only returning to serialized radio in the late 1940s. Phillips Lord, however, persevered, creating what would become one of the most successful of the radio cop shows in 1936.
Gangbusters!
A police procedural that advertised itself as authentic adventure, real cases, and real drama, all done in the name of civic improvement. In an early episode, the announcer declared openly and proudly the intention of the program. On this series, we present many hitherto unpublished inside facts of crime in the hope of arousing American citizens to a closer cooperation with the law enforcement officers in smashing the underworld. These shows benefited both from police cooperation, as we have already said, and the support of business. Fearing a resurgent U.S. labor movement and the rise of communist organizers around the country, business leaners were really keen by this point to win public support. One way to do that was to sponsor law and order programming. Hey, we're making sure that we support the guys taking care of the criminals. This both promulgated positive portrayals of the police and made the sponsors seem like thoughtful civic actors. Again and again, advertisers reminded listeners that they sponsored shows whose factual portrayals of police and criminals promoted the public welfare. Consider this intro from a 1945 episode, which kind of covers all of these patterns, the fact-based stuff, the civic-minded stuff, the war on crime stuff.
And now, in cooperation with police and federal law enforcement departments throughout the United States, the only national program that brings you authentic police case histories. Waterman's Pens and Waterman's Ink present Gangbusters.
Tonight, the case of the death mask killer who used an innocent girl to cover his elaborate plans, but who learned that even the spending of 3 copper pennies could change the course of his life.
Waterman's Pens, every one a master writing instrument, and Waterman's Ink, the ink that goes up to 3 times as far as ordinary inks, are proud to bring you Gangbusters, presenting facts in the endless war of the police on the underworld. Facts that show the operation of our law enforcement officials in their work of protecting our citizens. Gangbusters has asked Dr. Carlton Simon of New York City, internationally known criminologist, to narrate by proxy tonight's case. Well, now, Dr. Simon, I understand the criminal in tonight's case played a major part in the plot which led to a spectacular escape from Eastern Penitentiary last Easter.
He did indeed, Don Gardner. This killer, Bow Wow Bowers, was cunning, shrewd, and merciless.
His background must be of extreme interest to criminology, Dr. Simon.
It certainly is, Don. For the soundest way to combat crime is to know how the criminal's mind thinks and works.
Phillips Lord was an entertainer first and foremost, so he did not let civic duty get in the way of telling a good story. So despite the program's constant proclamations to factualness, his show emphasized action, thrill, and sensationalism over realism and detail. The crimes covered were technically true, but they were also the most incredible ones that producers could find. And to emphasize this, the show was bookended with the wails of police sirens and the cracks of machine gun fire, as we heard above. This overall emphasis on spectacular criminality may actually have impeded the show's purported law and order messaging, but regardless, he did also find it necessary to sometimes contour the sensational facts into the confines of radio production. In a 1936 episode, for example, the Livicoli Gang, which told the story of a massive arrest made by non-federal police, the producer spruced up the story with additional bits of thrill and excitement, including a courtroom scene in which the prosecution's key witness was a parrot. Now, this produced a stern letter from the prosecutor who'd been involved in the actual case, where no parrot had been in attendance. And Lord responded with a letter defending his creative decision. Quote, "Obviously, when one is dramatizing events for the radio, an entirely new technique has to be brought into play. We haven't got any eyes on the part of the audience to help us see what's going on. Everything must be done by description, or scenes reproduced in sound in some fashion. This makes it necessary that some incidents be changed, so that to those actually taking part in the event, they are hardly recognizable. But to the average listener who is not a detective, the main foundation of the capture and the apprehension of the criminals is clear." In his defense, the formula worked. Lord's show would remain on the air for over 20 years, finally airing its last episode in 1957, well into the age of television. By the latter half of the 1930s, a kind of modus vivendi had been reached between radio producers and police public relations personnel. Overall, the stories told about the police would be positive. The police would cooperate by providing authentic cases, and as time wore on, other kinds of technical assistance as well. But producers and creatives could take liberties with the facts of the case when considerations of production or audience entertainment predominated. This was sometimes an uneasy alliance, as the clash between Lord and Hoover illustrates, but like the best of alliances, that tension did not keep it from functioning to the basic satisfaction of both parties. Producers got help with their shows, cops got to be the heroes, and advertisers got to be seen sponsoring civic-minded entertainment. And for its part, the audience did get some good shows. Just because it's propaganda doesn't mean it's bad art. The functionality of this arrangement was expressed by an LAPD captain, James Davis, in an address he gave at the beginning of a 1934 episode of Calling All Cars, the Lieutenant Crowley murder.
Once more, we are pleased to present Chief James E. Davis.
Just kidding. I'm not going to make you listen to that whole thing. What he's saying is, quote, "Good evening, friends. Tonight is the 100th broadcast of Calling All Cars. It was with a certain amount of misgiving that I appeared on that first broadcast 100 weeks ago tonight. But my desire to bring the policeman's side of this story to the public outweighed the fear of possible criticism. The public spirit and civic-mindedness of the Rio Grande Oil Company in maintaining these broadcasts and the unflagging zeal of William S. Robson, their author and producer, in dramatically presenting them have justified my decision. From that first broadcast nearly 2 years ago, I remember saying that I hope that you, listening to these programs, would have a deeper understanding of your friend, the policeman, and a keener realization of the constant battle he wages to keep your city a decent place in which to live. This program has accomplished all that I hoped for it at the beginning." And by the 1940s, radio crime dramas had firmly established a working relationship with police across the country. They'd established a generic formula focused on apprehension, and they had a nationwide audience for authentic police adventure. So the stage has been set. Now we can turn back to gangsta films. The flames of crime panic, fanned by the press and the radio, by politicians and police officers, had their effect upon the movie-going public as well. Facing a political backlash to the supposedly antisocial messaging of their gangster films, Hollywood executives chose to impose censorship upon themselves in order to preempt any federal legislation. The result was the Hays Code, which specifically forbade glorification of the criminal. whatever that might mean, and it remained in effect until the late 1960s. Unlike the Radio Code of Ethics, created a decade earlier, this code actually contained enforcement mechanisms. So it had a real effect on the filmic output of an entire generation of Hollywood content. This Hays Code very quickly brought a much more friendly version of policing to U.S. moviegoers and formed part of the New Deal war on crime, spearheaded by FDR and his Attorney General Homer Cummings. With the advent of consistent film censorship came a marked rise in police heroes seeking to match or outdo the charisma of their criminal foes. The upward rise of an unusually charismatic criminal, a la 1931's Little Caesar, gave way to the righteous responses like G-Men from 1935, advocating law enforcement, quote, equipped to shoot to kill with the least possible waste of bullets. Lawlessness and disorder, these movies said, must be greeted with professionally applied force, fingerprint powder and gunpowder in equal measure. And if you could get James Cagney, who had once been a famous movie gangster, to star in some of these police shoot-'em-ups, all the better. As the film industry shifted focus from gangsters to gangbusters over the course of the 1930s, some producers looked to other subjects for their crime films. They didn't feel like making cop procedurals. Unwilling to anger the censor by focusing on outright gangsters, they turned back towards the hard-boiled detective. This may seem incongruous with the project to amplify police power, but remember that this quote-unquote project, singular, was really multiple projects, plural, occurring within and among various police departments and entertainment studios and producers. Moreover, even ideologically devout producers who loved the police and wanted to spread their message of friendliness and professionalism, they wanted to make money. And so they could be drawn in by the potential profit to be made from adapting existing hard-boiled stories. And these efforts would combine with the influx of filmmakers fleeing Nazi-infected Europe to give to us film noir. The moralizing thrillers of the late 1930s and 40s would now share space with a genre that specifically sought a kind of unclarity, even as many noir stories ultimately concluded with a production code-induced righteous ending. Film noir blended different generic elements from horror, from gangster, mystery, the social problem film, and the result was a subgenre which adhered to the code on the surface, crime doesn't pay, good triumphs, but it boiled with subsurface moral ambiguity. The investigator himself, usually not a police officer, rarely achieved an unambiguous victory. He frequently met a violent end himself. In stark contrast to the earlier gangster films, characters were even eroticized in a way which befogged the difference between good and evil. Yeah, the woman was a femme fatale, but she still had an allure to her that would be uncomfortable, I think, for a lot of conservatives to deal with. Again, the Hays Code forced these movies to end in a morally upright way, but because the filmmakers privileged the exotic milieu of corruption over the defeat of crime, they maintained much of the transgression audiences had once found so alluring about gangster films. As noir developed in the post-World War II period, it increasingly highlighted the unease felt by many across the country. Contrary to the rosy myths conservatives love to tell about the 1950s as an age of stability and consensus, the post-war United States experienced the same shocks that societies often experience after the devastation of war. Economic dislocation, lack of purpose, shifting of roles and expectations. And these issues, plus the population boom that followed the war, would give post-war officials much behavior to police and storytellers much material to work with. As GIs reintegrate into the workforce, as more and more young people start to come about and become teenagers and form gangs and have switchblades, there's just so much. So having talked about gangster films, police procedural films, and early film noir, there's one more genre that we have to talk about that emerged in the late 1940s early 1950s. It has some overlap with film noir and police procedurals. All of these guys can kind of blend together in different ways, but this is also a distinct thing. It's the semi-documentary drama. So after the U.S. entered World War II, many actors, directors, and other creatives entered the military to work in various capacities, from bomber pilot to propaganda maker. Unsurprisingly, when they returned from the war, they drew upon these experiences when making new art. Jimmy Stewart emerged from the war to make more serious, hard-bitten movies. William Wyler, a noted director, immediately came back from the war and made Best Years of Our Lives, a movie that still holds up to this day. So you haven't seen it, please go watch that. It is incredible. George Stevens, for his part, had been a director known for his screwball comedies, but he returned from the war having filmed the liberation of Dachau, never to make a comedy again. At 20th Century Fox Studios, then led by Darryl Zanuck, who in the 1930s had actually produced a number of gangster movies, veteran filmmakers returned to begin forging the semi-documentary film. Now, this tried to incorporate the documentary techniques learned during the war into the creation of stories that kind of grappled with institutions, explored their inner workings, their personnel, and how citizens related to these centers of power. This institutional analysis was not skeptical, however. Unlike film noir, which seethed at authority, these films championed it. And this makes sense. After all, they were made by people who had witnessed the victory of their just cause. They had witnessed large institutions like the U.S. Army fighting for something noble. In this way, the semi-documentary film partook of a general, but obviously far from universal, post-war confidence in U.S. institutions, which historians generally refer to as the liberal consensus. As summarized by scholar Claudia Calhoun, who has written the most recent, and I would say pretty definitive book on Jack Webb and Dragnet, quote, "The driving question of these films is how the authorizing agency will address the problems presented. Nearly all of the films in the cycle are linear accounts of successful investigations, portraits of effective bureaucracy at work. Moreover, most were based on real-life crimes that had been successfully solved, so audiences knew, even before the film started, that the system worked." First of these was 20th Century Fox's The House on 92nd Street from 1945, and gained popularity largely for its novelty, as both audiences and critics had grown tired and kind of frustrated with Hollywood's more traditional output, and they relished the careful attention to detail and the social interest of this new batch of films. House on 92nd Street, for example, the opening credits are in the style of an FBI portfolio file folder. So as you turn the pages of this supposed crime, you get the opening credits. It's kind of cool. This realism was often achieved with the cooperation of the authorities. In House on 92nd Street, for example, the FBI actually loaned the filmmakers surveillance equipment so as to facilitate discreet filming on public streets. A couple years later, in 1948, came the pinnacle of this genre, The Naked City. Through the adept combination of several techniques, this film broke new ground in U.S. crime fiction, influencing really all subsequent cop shows and movies. So let's lounge with this for a few paragraphs. It's worth taking a good look at. The first thing is the film used the city itself, in this case New York, not merely as a backdrop, but as a character in its own right. These buildings have personality. The little people in it have personality too, not just the police and not just the criminal. This was accomplished through on-location shooting rather than filming in a Los Angeles-based studio. And this was something that was coming into vogue at the time, partly due to technological innovation. Cameras were getting smaller, sound equipment is getting better. It was really hard to lug these giant cameras around city streets. It was impossible to pick up the right kind of audio and that kind of thing. So with smaller cameras and crews that are experienced in wartime photography, you get crews that are more able to handle this kind of environment, this kind of filming environment. Second, the murder at the center of the film was solved by a team of competent but not superhuman police officers. They used the tried and true methods of detection and scientific analysis, aided by the occasional policeman's hunch, but it's not just about their intuition. Like some of Sherlock Holmes, it's kind of magic, but this is much more by the book. Third, the police themselves, the actual characters, in addition to being portrayed as pretty regular people, were also shown to have families, a home life, something outside the precinct or the crime scene. They had fuller internal lives, a sense of humor, a foible, some kind of personality, an emotional connection to their work. They were not just government automatons. That's unusual for this time period. Fourth, the writer, Malvin Wald, incorporated actual research that he did, shadowing NYPD detectives, taking a police academy course, reading through police files, and attending actual autopsies. We'll see echoes of this in Jack Webb when he creates Dragnet. Fifth, the film cobbled together disparate tropes that would henceforth become staples of the police procedural. The securing of the crime scene, the good cop, bad cop routine, the suspect lying, especially during early questioning, the family of the victims identifying the body, the characterization of homicide investigation as just mundane police work, rather than portraying it melodramatically, the pursuit of suspects across vibrant urban territory, that kind of thing. Finally, the film used an authoritative narrator to contextualize events. Though a common trope of many crime films, especially detective fiction and film noir, the narrator here is disembodied and omniscient. That was a lot of information, so let's conclude by kind of collecting ourselves. We've gone over the emergence of radio and film as centers of mass media. We talked about their often unflattering early depictions of the police and the various ways in which politicians and police reacted to these portrayals. We noted that all of these media developments occurred within the Great Depression and mentioned the war on crime as the backdrop. And we ended by highlighting some of the most popular and influential police fiction in both radio and film of the era. Pay particular attention to the cooperation that emerged between police officials and radio creatives, and film creatives too, and to the various tropes and techniques employed by early police procedurals in both radio and film. In a myriad of ways, Jack Webb would draw from both of these mediums as he developed Dragnet in the early 1950s. This political, economic, and artistic context make up a good portion of Dragnet's genetic lineage. And the world of early TV comprised the other major half. So it is there that we will turn our attention next week. How TV developed, its economics, how it was produced, advertisers, sponsors, censorship, early crime stuff that came before Dragnet, the whole 9 yards. Before I go, just an appendix. Why cover individuals at all? So this is called the propagandists. So we're talking about people that propagandize on behalf of the police. But why talk about them in particular as individuals? Because history is replete with movements, with organizations and ideas that dominate time periods and contextualize events. How do we analyze these larger historical forces without losing the individual? And how do we highlight individual effort and responsibility without succumbing to the tempting simplicity of great man thinking, of just assuming that one guy was responsible for all of this stuff? By way of an answer, consider TV scholar Jimmy Reeves. Quote, "In discarding the old skin of traditional criticism, too focused on authorial intent, we must take care to preserve a portion of the wine of authorship. For to siphon out the community of creators from the blend of culture is to deny human beings any responsibility for history, and to surrender to the despair of some reductive form of psychological, economic, or technological determinism. Ideologies and economies and institutions and technologies are all human products, and human intervention and struggle can still change history. But in sharing responsibility for history, we must also recognize the need to hold people accountable for their contributions to maintaining or transforming the world." If individuals still make for worthy phenomena of historical study in their own right, that still leaves another question. TV is a collaborative medium, so why focus on producers like Jack Webb rather than the myriads of other professionals involved in the creative process, the directors, the writers, the network executives? These are all worthy fields of study, but my answer is that, especially within the context of U.S. network television at its height, so 1950 to the year 2000, executive producers made up the vast majority of decisions about their shows, and they did so sitting at a fascinating institutional crossroads. To quote from Jimmy Reeves again, because of the scale of series production, television producers can ill afford to indulge in the pretenses of the legitimate art business. Rather than wear the legitimate artist's mask of disinterestedness, rather than engage in a ritual disavowal of economic interest, television producers combine the role of the narrative artist with that of the trader in cultural goods. And as storytellers who cut deals, watch the bottom line, and live and die by the ratings, television producers are actively engaged as interpreters of the culture. When devising a new series or revamping an old one, they take their place beside advertising agents and fashion designers as what has been called the hucksters of the symbol. As hucksters of the symbol, television producers are engaged in an ongoing revision of the American way, a revision that translates the conflicts and contradictions of modern life into terms that are comprehensible and forms that are meaningful to a vast, heterogeneous audience. TV executive producer and writer, and I guess occasional feature film director, who knows, Michael Mann reinforced this idea when he told an interviewer in 2002, quote, "If you asked what the equivalent," can I do a Chicago accent? If you asked what the equivalent, no, I can't. If you ask what the equivalent of directing a feature film in television is, it's the executive producer. That is where you set the style, you set the content, you set the tone. The cinematics and the storytelling, the use of music, you actually set that on an episode-by-episode basis. As we'll see when we get to Michael Mann's work in particular, Miami Vice, for instance, he also thought of his TV production work as a kind of propaganda, hucking symbols of a particular type. Thanks again for listening to this week's episode. Join me next time when we talk about early TV history. Music by Carl Casey at White Bat Audio. Find me at Blue Sky, Owen-Symes, YouTube at Integral History, and check out my book, He Was Our Man in Washington, A History of the Obama Years. See you next time.